That Thursday afternoon started like any other in my retirement. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the leather worn smooth from 27 years of coming home tired from the elementary school where I worked as head custodian. The October sun was filtering through my living room curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor I'd refinished myself just last spring. At 62, I'd earned my quiet afternoons with coffee and the newspaper crossword puzzle. The phone rang at exactly 5:15. I glanced at the caller ID and saw it was Mrs. Loretta Vance from the Blue House next door. In the 12 years I'd lived on Maple Street, Loretta and I had maintained the kind of neighborly distance that suited us both. Polite waves across the yard, occasional conversations about the weather, but nothing deeper. She was a retired teacher, probably in her 70s, who kept to herself and tended a small but immaculate flower garden. "Clarence," her voice was trembling in a way I'd never heard before. "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." I set down my coffee cup, immediately alert. "What's wrong, Loretta?" "Don't open your door tonight. Not until after 6 o'clock. I don't care who knocks or what they say. Promise me you won't open that door." I frowned, looking toward my front window. The street appeared normal. Kids riding bikes, Mrs. Patterson walking her small dog, the usual rhythm of suburban life. "Loretta, what's this about? Are you in some kind of trouble? Just promise me, Clarence, for your own safety. And maybe call the police if anyone tries to force their way in." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Loretta wasn't the type for drama or paranoia. She was practical, sensible, the kind of woman who'd taught 4th grade for 30 years and handled everything from playground fights to parent conferences with calm authority. "All right," I said slowly. "I promise. But Loretta, if something's wrong..." The line went dead. I tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. Not 5 minutes later, someone started knocking on my front door. The sound made my blood freeze because I recognized the pattern immediately. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more deliberate knocks. That was Henry's knock. My brother Henry, who'd been dead for over 10 years. My name is Clarence Boone, and this is my story. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I gripped the arms of my chair, telling myself it was coincidence. Lots of people knocked in different patterns. But my hands were shaking as I watched the clock on the mantel tick past 5:30. The knocking came again at 5:45, more insistent this time, followed by the sound of footsteps pacing across my front porch. Every instinct told me to look through the peephole to see who was there, but Loretta's urgent words echoed in my mind. At exactly 6:01, I walked to the front door, turned the deadbolt, and pulled it open. The porch was empty. No car in the driveway, no figure retreating down the street. But there on my doormat lay a manila envelope, thick and official-looking, with my name written across it in bold black letters. Below my name, in the same careful handwriting, were 2 words that made my world tilt. And Henry Boone. I carried the envelope inside with hands that trembled despite my efforts to stay calm. The paper felt expensive. Heavyweight stock that lawyers and banks used for important documents. I set it on my kitchen table under the bright overhead light and examined it carefully before opening. The handwriting was precise, masculine, written with what looked like a fountain pen. It was exactly how Henry used to write. He'd always been particular about his penmanship, a habit left over from Catholic school and the nuns who'd wrapped knuckles for sloppy letters. Inside the envelope was a property deed, professionally printed on legal paper with official seals and notary stamps. It was a deed for my house, 1247 Maple Street, signed by me and dated just 1 week ago. The signature looked perfect, every loop and flourish exactly matching my own handwriting. But below my signature was another name that made my throat close up. Henry Boone, with a signature that was unmistakably his, the ink still dark and fresh as if he'd signed it yesterday. My brother Henry had died of a massive heart attack 11 years ago, found alone in his apartment by a landlord who'd come looking for overdue rent. We hadn't spoken in the 2 years before his death, not since our bitter fight over our parents' inheritance. Henry had accused me of manipulating documents, of forging signatures to get a larger share of the estate. The accusations had hurt more than any punch could have, because they came from the brother I'd looked up to my entire life. I sat staring at that impossible signature until my coffee grew cold. Henry's handwriting had always been distinctive, bold strokes with a slight rightward slant, the way he crossed his T's with a confident flourish. This signature had every one of those characteristics. If I didn't know better, I'd swear he'd signed it himself. The phone rang again, making me jump. Loretta's voice was barely above a whisper. "Clarence, are you there? Are you all right?" "I'm here." "Loretta, what do you know about this?" "I saw him. The man who left that envelope. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a gray business suit. He walked right up to your door like he belonged there, set that envelope down, and walked back to his car." "What kind of car?" "That's what scared me, Clarence. It was an old sedan, dark blue, maybe from the 80s. It looked exactly like—" She paused, and I could hear her breathing heavily. "It looked exactly like the car your brother used to drive. Same dent in the front bumper, same rust spots along the roofline." I dropped the phone and rushed to my front window, pulling back the curtain with shaking fingers. Across the street, parked under the yellow glow of the streetlight, was Henry's 1987 Buick LeSabre. I'd know that car anywhere. I'd helped him buy it from a used car lot downtown when he'd gotten his first real job. The same faded paint, the same crooked antenna, even the same crack running across the rear windshield. A figure sat behind the wheel, perfectly still, watching my house with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Sleep was impossible that night. I spent hours sitting in my chair, watching through the curtains as that dark blue Buick remained parked across the street. The figure inside never moved, never got out, never even turned on the interior light. By 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally drove me upstairs, but even then I couldn't rest. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind through the oak tree outside my bedroom window had me sitting up in bed with my heart pounding. At dawn, the car was gone. I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of retirement had affected me more than I'd realized. Maybe living alone in this big house was making me paranoid. But the envelope was still on my kitchen table, the impossible signature still dark on the legal paper. That's when I decided to go to the attic. I hadn't been up there in months, maybe longer. The pull-down ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed into the dusty space under the eaves. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, filled with Christmas decorations, old photo albums, and the accumulated debris of a lifetime. In the far corner, covered by an old sheet, was Henry's trunk. I'd brought it home after his funeral, telling myself I'd go through it someday when the grief wasn't so fresh. 11 years later, that day had never come. Now I pulled off the sheet and opened the heavy lid, releasing the smell of old leather and my brother's cologne, something woody and expensive that he'd always been particular about. Inside were the remnants of Henry's life. High school photographs showing the two of us in football uniforms. He'd been the star quarterback while I'd warmed the bench. College diplomas and certificates from his engineering degree. Letters from girlfriends whose names I'd forgotten. And at the bottom, wrapped in a rubber band, were the documents from our parents' estate. I spread them out on the attic floor, studying them by the weak light from the single bulb. Our parents had died within 6 months of each other when I was 45 and Henry was 48. They'd left us their house, some savings, and a small insurance policy. Nothing extravagant, but enough to matter. The will was clear. Everything split equally between their 2 sons. But Henry had been drinking heavily in those days, struggling with depression after his divorce. He'd missed meetings with the lawyer, forgotten to sign papers, showed up to the probate court drunk one morning. I'd handled most of the estate business myself because someone had to. When Henry accused me of manipulating the process, of somehow cheating him out of his rightful inheritance, I'd been too hurt and too proud to defend myself. Now, sitting in my dusty attic with those old papers spread before me, I could see how it must have looked from his perspective. His sober, responsible little brother handling all the details, making all the decisions, while he stumbled through his alcoholic haze. No wonder he'd suspected conspiracy where there had only been necessity. The next morning, I walked over to Loretta's house. I needed to thank her for her warning, to find out what else she might have seen. But when I knocked on her front door, there was no answer. The windows were dark behind drawn curtains, and her car wasn't in the driveway. I tried the back door and found it unlocked, unusual for Loretta, who was normally careful about security. The kitchen was empty, but something felt wrong. Her old radio, which she always kept tuned to the classical music station at low volume, was blaring a talk show at full volume. Newspapers were scattered across her kitchen table, and a coffee cup sat half full, as if she'd left in a hurry. On the table, written in her careful teacher's handwriting, was a note. "Gone to stay with my sister in Toledo. Don't trust anyone who asks about you. L.V." Loretta had fled, and the timing couldn't be coincidence. The next morning brought no clarity, only more questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. I couldn't shake the image of that car, or the feeling that someone was watching me, studying my movements, learning my habits. The forged deed lay on my kitchen table like an accusation, and I found myself staring at Henry's impossible signature until the letters blurred together. I decided to visit Riverside Elementary, the school where I'd worked for 27 years. Principal Morrison had always said I was welcome any time, that the building would never be the same without me keeping everything running smoothly. Maybe being around familiar faces and familiar sounds would help me think more clearly, would remind me that I was still the same practical, level-headed man I'd always been. The school was exactly as I'd left it when I retired 6 months ago. The same worn linoleum floors that I'd mopped thousands of times, the same bulletin boards covered with children's artwork, the same smell of chalk dust and cafeteria food that had been the background of my working life. Mrs. Patterson, the secretary, greeted me with a warm smile and asked how retirement was treating me. "Oh, you know," I said, trying to keep my voice light, still adjusting to all that free time. But when I walked outside to the parking lot 20 minutes later, my blood turned to ice. The dark blue Buick was there, parked across the street from the school entrance, positioned so the driver had a clear view of anyone coming or going. The same rust spots, the same crooked antenna, the same crack in the rear windshield. This time I didn't hesitate. I walked directly across the street toward the car, my hands clenched into fists despite my age. I wanted to see who was playing this sick game, wanted to look into the face of whoever was using my dead brother's memory to torment me. The man behind the wheel was tall and lean, just as Loretta had described, wearing an expensive gray suit that looked out of place in this blue-collar neighborhood. He had sharp features and cold eyes that watched me approach with calculating intelligence. But as soon as I got within 50 feet of the car, he started the engine and pulled away from the curb with deliberate calm, as if my pursuit meant nothing to him. I stood in the middle of the street, breathing hard, feeling foolish and helpless as the Buick disappeared around the corner. But the man had left something behind. A folded piece of paper weighted down with a small stone on the exact spot where the car had been parked. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the note. The message was brief, written in the same careful handwriting as the envelope. "You should have left things as they were, Clarence. Some graves are better left undisturbed." The handwriting was perfect, every letter exactly matching Henry's distinctive style. Whoever was doing this had either found samples of my brother's writing to copy, or possessed skills that bordered on the supernatural. That evening, as darkness settled over Maple Street, I heard noises in my backyard. Soft footsteps on gravel, the gentle scrape of metal against wood. I grabbed my father's old flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slipped out through the back door, moving as quietly as my 62-year-old bones would allow. The beam of the flashlight revealed disturbed earth near my garden shed, as if someone had been digging. Fresh footprints led from the alley gate to my back porch and back again. But it was what I found on the ground that made my heart stop completely. It was a photograph, torn down the middle with deliberate precision. The picture showed Henry and me as young men, maybe 25 and 28, standing arm in arm in front of our parents' house on the day we'd inherited it. We were both smiling, both hopeful about the future, both believing that brotherhood was stronger than money or property or pride. Someone had ripped the photograph exactly down the center, separating Henry's image from mine, leaving us forever divided by that jagged tear. On the back, in Henry's handwriting, were 2 words that hit me like a physical blow. Never again. Sunday arrived with the oppressive weight of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Denise came for her usual visit, but from the moment she walked through my front door, I could tell something was different. My daughter had always been punctual to a fault, a trait she'd inherited from her mother. But today she arrived 20 minutes late, flustered and checking her phone every few seconds like she was expecting an important call. At 34, Denise had my late wife's gentle features but my stubborn streak. She worked as a paralegal downtown, had been divorced for 3 years, and visited me religiously every Sunday afternoon. We'd established this routine after her mother died 8 years ago, a way of maintaining connection despite the different directions our lives had taken. "Sorry I'm late, Dad," she said, barely meeting my eyes as she set her purse on the coffee table. Traffic was terrible on Highway 9. But Highway 9 was never backed up on Sunday afternoons, and Denise knew I knew that. I poured coffee into her favorite mug, the one with painted sunflowers that her daughter Emma had made in pottery class, and settled into my chair across from her. "Everything all right at work?" I asked, studying her face carefully. "Fine, just busy. You know how it is." She wrapped her hands around the mug, but didn't drink, her eyes darting toward the front window every few seconds. That's when I decided to tell her about the envelope, about the forged deed with Henry's impossible signature, about the mysterious man in the gray suit and the dark blue Buick that seemed to follow me everywhere. As I spoke, I watched her face change from concern to something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. "Dad," she said when I finished, her voice carefully controlled. "Uncle Henry's been dead for 11 years. Don't you think maybe you're just... Well, maybe retirement is harder than you expected. Maybe being alone in this big house is making you remember things differently." Her words stung because they echoed my own fears, the doubts that crept in during the long hours before dawn, when rational explanations seemed possible. But there was something in her tone, a rehearsed quality that suggested she'd been prepared for this conversation. "I'm not imagining things, Denise. I have the deed right here, with signatures that were made last week. I have the notes, the photograph. Dad, please." She stood up abruptly, checking her phone again. "Maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor, or your doctor. Sometimes stress can make us see patterns that aren't really there." The phrase "see patterns that aren't really there" stopped me cold. It was too clinical, too precise, like something a lawyer might say. Denise worked for lawyers, but she'd never talked like one before. "I should probably go," she said, already reaching for her purse. "Emma has a soccer game this afternoon, and I promised I'd be there early." But Emma was only 6 years old, and her soccer games were on Saturdays, not Sundays. Denise had never been confused about her own daughter's schedule before. I walked her to the door, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask. As she hugged me goodbye, I felt the stiffness in her shoulders, the way she seemed eager to break away from physical contact. "Take care of yourself, Dad," she said, not quite looking at me. "And maybe think about what I said." From my front window, I watched her walk to her car, a red Honda Civic parked in my driveway. But as she reached the street, another car pulled up to the curb, the dark blue Buick. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched the man in the gray suit get out and open the passenger door for my daughter. Denise looked back at my house once, her face pale and frightened, before getting into the car with the stranger. The man closed the door with the careful courtesy of someone who knew he was being watched, then turned toward my window and touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute. My own daughter knew this man. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach, leaving me gasping and dizzy. Whatever was happening to me, Denise was part of it. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams of Henry standing at my front door, demanding to know why I'd stolen what belonged to him. I woke at 5 in the morning with a plan forming in my mind. If someone was using legal documents to manipulate me, I needed to understand exactly what kind of game they were playing. Robert Crawford had been practicing law in our town for over 50 years. He'd handled our parents' estate, Henry's will, and dozens of other legal matters for our family over the decades. Now in his 80s, he still maintained a small office above the hardware store on Main Street, though he'd long since stopped taking new clients. I found him there at 9 o'clock sharp, sitting behind the same oak desk he'd used since the Eisenhower administration. His white hair was perfectly combed, his bow tie precisely knotted, and his pale blue eyes were as sharp as they'd been when he was 40. Age had bent his shoulders and lined his face, but it hadn't dulled his mind. "Clarence," he said, gesturing for me to sit in the cracked leather chair across from his desk. "I was sorry to hear about your retirement. How are you adjusting to civilian life?" "That's actually why I'm here, Mr. Crawford. I need to ask you about Henry's estate." Something shifted in the old lawyer's expression, a wariness that hadn't been there moments before. "That was settled years ago, Clarence. Everything was handled according to his wishes." "I know, but I need to understand exactly what those wishes were." Crawford opened a file cabinet behind his desk and withdrew a thick folder. "Your brother came to see me about 6 months before he died. He was troubled, drinking heavily, making accusations about the handling of your parents' estate. He wanted to make changes to his will." "What kind of changes?" "He claimed you'd manipulated the probate process, that you'd somehow cheated him out of his rightful inheritance. He was convinced you'd forged documents, bribed officials, used your position as executor to steal from him." The words hit me like physical blows. I'd known Henry suspected me, but hearing the full extent of his paranoia was devastating. "Did you believe him?" Crawford removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture I remembered from childhood when he'd delivered bad news to our family. "Henry was not well, Clarence. The drinking, the depression, the isolation, they'd affected his judgment. But he was adamant. He wanted to change his will to leave everything to Denise instead of you." "Everything?" "But Henry didn't have much. Actually, he had more than you might think. A life insurance policy through his engineering firm, some investments he'd made in his sober periods, and a small inheritance from your Aunt Margaret that he'd never mentioned to anyone. All told, it amounted to nearly $200,000. The number shocked me. Henry had always lived simply, never flashing money or talking about investments. I'd assumed he'd died with nothing but debts and regrets. He changed the will? Yes. Everything went to Denise, with the stipulation that the money be used for her daughter's education. He said he couldn't trust you, but he could trust your daughter to do right by his grandniece." Crawford pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. It was Henry's amended will, signed and notarized, with Denise listed as the sole beneficiary. At the bottom was Henry's distinctive signature, identical to the one I'd seen on the forged deed. "Mr. Crawford," I said carefully, "has anyone else asked to see these documents recently?" The old lawyer's face grew troubled. "As a matter of fact, yes. A young woman came by last week asking for copies of everything related to Henry's estate. She said she was doing genealogy research for the family." "Did she give you her name?" Crawford consulted his visitor's log and showed me the entry. Written in neat handwriting was, "Denise Boone, Family Records Research." My daughter had been here, asking questions about money I'd never known existed, examining documents I'd never seen. The pieces of a puzzle I didn't understand were slowly fitting together, and the picture they formed made my stomach turn. I drove home from Crawford's office in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd learned. $200,000. Henry had left that money to Denise, money that could change her life, pay for Emma's college education, provide the financial security that had always seemed just out of reach for my daughter. But how did that connect to the forged deed, The mysterious man in the gray suit, the campaign of psychological warfare that seemed designed to make me question my own sanity. The answers started coming that evening when I tried to call Denise. I dialed her cell phone number, the same one I'd been calling for years, but the voice that answered wasn't hers. "Hello, Mr. Boone." The voice was smooth, cultured, with the kind of confidence that came from expensive education and years of getting what you wanted. "I was wondering when you'd call." "Who is this? Where's my daughter?" "Denise is unavailable at the moment. She's reconsidering some recent decisions. You understand how stressful family finances can be." My grip tightened on the phone. "I want to talk to her. Now. I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, Denise has come to understand that you've had quite enough control over family matters. 27 years of steady employment, a comfortable pension, this lovely house, all paid off. Meanwhile, your daughter struggles to make ends meet, raising a child alone, working long hours for barely enough to survive. What do you want? Nothing dramatic, nothing traumatic. Just a simple recognition that age brings certain challenges, memory issues, confusion about financial matters, the kind of problems that require younger, more capable family members to step in and provide guidance. The words chilled me because they revealed the scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just about money or property. Someone was building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent. Your daughter cares about you, Mr. Boone. She wants to make sure you're properly cared for in your golden years. There are excellent facilities available, places where you can live comfortably without the burden of maintaining a large house, managing finances, making complex decisions. You're talking about putting me in a nursing home. I'm talking about ensuring your safety and well-being. And in return, your daughter would be able to access the inheritance that her uncle left for her, money that's been tied up in legal complications for far too long. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my kitchen with the phone still pressed to my ear, the dial tone buzzing like an angry wasp. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. A woman claiming to be from the county's Adult Protective Services knocked on my door with forms to sign. "Just routine documentation," she assured me, "to make sure you're getting the support you need." When I asked to see her identification, she produced a badge and business card that looked official enough, but something about her manner seemed rehearsed. The forms were printed on the same yellowish legal paper as the forged deed, and they asked detailed questions about my daily routines, my ability to manage money, whether I'd experienced any confusion or memory problems lately. I told her I needed time to review everything with my own lawyer, and she left with obvious reluctance, promising to return in a few days. That night, I carefully examined the business card she'd left behind. The phone number was local, but when I called it the next morning, I got an automated message saying the mailbox was full. The address led to a vacant office building downtown that had been empty for months. Someone was creating an elaborate fiction around my supposed mental decline, complete with fake officials and forged documents, and my own daughter was part of it. For 3 days, I lived in a state of paranoid vigilance, jumping at every unexpected sound, scrutinizing every piece of mail, questioning every phone call. The fake social worker hadn't returned as promised, but I knew that was temporary. Whatever web was being woven around me was still under construction, and I needed to understand its scope before it tightened completely. That's when Loretta came home. I was sitting on my front porch that Tuesday afternoon, trying to look casual while keeping watch for any unusual activity, when her old Toyota pulled into the driveway next door. She got out slowly, looking every one of her 70-something years, and I could see the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she leaned heavily on her walking stick. "Loretta," I called out, hurrying across the yard to meet her. "Thank God you're back. Are you all right?" She looked around nervously before answering, her eyes scanning the street for signs of surveillance. "I couldn't stay away, Clarence. I kept thinking about what might be happening to you, and I realized I had something you needed to see." She led me into her house, moving through the rooms like someone checking for intruders. The place smelled of disuse and fear, dust covers thrown over furniture,
newspapers stacked by the door as if she'd been planning to leave again at a moment's notice.
"I've been watching that man," she said, pulling a small digital camera from her purse. "The one in the gray suit. I started taking pictures weeks ago, before any of this business with the envelope started. The camera was an old model, the kind with a tiny screen that required squinting to see the images clearly, but what I saw there made my blood run cold. Photo after photo showed the man in the gray suit conducting what looked like surveillance operations around our neighborhood. In one image, he was parked across from the elementary school, photographing the building with a telephoto lens. In another, he was standing outside the hardware store where Crawford's law office was located, apparently watching who came and going. A third photo showed him sitting in his car near the bank where I did my business, taking notes in a small notebook. He's been studying you, Clarence, learning your routines, your habits, the places you go regularly. But it was the next series of photos that truly shocked me. They showed the man meeting with Denise outside a law office I didn't recognize, not Crawford's place, but a modern glass building downtown. In one image, they were examining documents spread across the hood of his car. In another, Denise was handing him what looked like a thick envelope. "When were these taken?" "Last Thursday, the day before you received that envelope with your brother's signature." Loretta scrolled to the final photo, and my heart nearly stopped. It showed the man and Denise standing outside my house, both of them looking at their watches with the coordinated precision of people executing a plan. The timestamp on the photo read 5:47 p.m., just minutes before Loretta had called to warn me about not opening my door. "I heard them talking," she said quietly. "They were close enough to my window that I could make out some of what they said." "The man told your daughter, 'He always opens the door at 6:01, just like clockwork. 30 years of routine make a man predictable.' The revelation hit me like a physical blow. They'd been studying my habits, timing their psychological assault to coincide with my predictable behaviors. Even my punctuality had been weaponized against me. "There's more," Loretta continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I followed them after they left your house that first night. They went to a hotel on the interstate, the kind of place where people pay cash and don't ask questions. I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours, watching them through the lobby windows. Your daughter looked scared, Clarence. Not guilty, scared. Like she'd gotten involved in something bigger than she understood. I stared at the tiny screen, studying the images that revealed the careful orchestration of my torment. Someone had spent weeks, maybe months, preparing for this campaign against me. And they'd used my own daughter as their inside source. That night, I sat in my kitchen with Loretta's camera and all the evidence spread before me like pieces of a complex puzzle. The forged deed, the photographs of surveillance, the fake social worker's business card. Everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan to strip me of my independence and my property. But knowing about the conspiracy and proving it were two different things entirely. I'd spent 27 years as a custodian, learning that the best way to catch someone doing something wrong was to give them exactly what they expected, then be ready when they made their move. If these people wanted to use my predictability against me, I'd give them predictability, with a few surprises they weren't counting on. The plan I formed was simple, but required precise timing. I called the phone number the fake social worker had left, knowing it would go to that full mailbox, and left a message saying I was ready to sign the papers she'd brought. Then I set up Loretta's camera in my front window, positioned to capture everything that happened on my porch and in my living room. At 5:30 the next evening, I made coffee and settled into my usual chair with the newspaper, exactly as I'd done for years. But this time, my phone was recording, hidden behind the lamp on my side table. I'd also left certain items in plain sight on my coffee table, copies of all the forged documents, printed emails showing Denise's meeting with Crawford, and a handwritten note that read, "I know who you are and what you want." The knocking began at exactly 6 o'clock, that familiar 3-tap pause, 2-tap pattern that still sent shivers down my spine. I remained perfectly still, appearing to doze in my chair, as I'd done countless evenings before. At 6:01, I heard the soft sound of a key turning in my front door lock. The man in the grey suit entered with practiced silence, moving through my living room like someone who'd been there before. He was tall and lean, probably in his 40s, with the kind of predatory confidence that came from years of taking advantage of vulnerable people. He spoke quietly into his phone as he approached my coffee table. "He's asleep in his chair," just like she said. "The old man's completely out of it. This is going to be easier than we thought." That's when he saw what I'd left for him. The documents, the photographs, the note with his name on it. I watched through half-closed eyes as his face changed from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear. "Cole Rivers," I said quietly, sitting up in my chair. "Real estate developer. Specializes in acquiring properties from elderly owners at below-market prices." He spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward something inside his jacket. "Mr. Boone, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding was mine, thinking my daughter wouldn't sell me out for money." Cole's composure was slipping, but he tried to maintain control. "Denise was trying to help you. You're not thinking clearly anymore, and she's concerned about your ability to live independently. Clear enough to record everything you just said." I held up my phone, which had been capturing our entire conversation, "including your admission that you've been studying my habits, using my daughter as an informant, and planning to steal my house." His face went pale, but before he could respond, we heard the sound of sirens approaching. Loretta, bless her heart, had been watching from her window and called the police the moment she saw Cole enter my house with a key. The front door opened, and 2 uniformed officers entered with their hands on their weapons. Behind them, looking stricken and terrified, was my daughter Denise. "Dad," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." The police station's fluorescent lights were harsh and unforgiving, casting everything in stark relief as we sat in a small conference room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. Detective Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and graying temples, had separated us for individual interviews before bringing us all together to sort out the truth. Cole Rivers sat at one end of the table, his expensive suit looking rumpled now, his earlier confidence replaced by the calculating wariness of someone trying to figure out how much trouble he was really in. Denise sat across from me, her face puffy from crying, unable to meet my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. "Let's start from the beginning," Detective Rodriguez said, opening a file folder thick with documents. "Mr. Rivers, you were found in Mr. Boone's house with a key that doesn't belong to you, in possession of what appear to be forged legal documents. How do you explain that?" Cole straightened his tie, trying to project the same professional authority that had probably fooled dozens of victims before me. "Detective, I think you'll find this is simply a family matter that's gotten out of hand. Ms. Boone contacted me because she was concerned about her father's mental state. The key was given to me by her, and the documents are legitimate estate planning materials." "That's not true," Denise whispered, finally finding her voice. "I mean, part of it's true, but not the way he's making it sound." Detective Rodriguez turned her attention to my daughter. "Why don't you tell us your version of events, Ms. Boone?" Denise took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. "It started about 3 months ago. I was having money problems, the divorce, Emma's medical bills, student loans. I was behind on everything, and I didn't know how to tell Dad because he'd already helped so much over the years." She glanced at Cole, who was watching her with the intensity of a snake sizing up prey. "Mr. Rivers approached me at the courthouse where I work. He said he'd been researching property records and noticed that Dad owned his house free and clear, that it was worth a lot more than Dad probably realized. He said there were ways to help elderly people access their equity while still allowing them to live comfortably." "What kind of ways?" the detective asked. "Reverse mortgages, equity loans, things like that." But then he started asking questions about Dad's mental state, whether he was still sharp enough to handle complex financial decisions. He made it sound like he was concerned about Dad being taken advantage of by unscrupulous people. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. When did the conversation change from helping your father to deceiving him? Denise's voice broke. When Mr. Rivers told me about Uncle Henry's inheritance, he said he'd done research and discovered that Henry had left money to me, but that it was tied up because of Dad's role as executor of the estate. He showed me documents that made it look like Dad had been mismanaging things. What kind of documents? Bank records that showed Dad moving money between accounts, signatures that looked questionable, correspondence with lawyers that seemed to indicate Dad was hiding assets. Mr. Rivers said that if Dad was declared mentally incompetent, I could access my inheritance and use it to provide better care for him. Detective Rodriguez made notes as Denise spoke, occasionally glancing at Cole, who sat stone-faced at the far end of the table. How much money are we talking about? $200,000 from Uncle Henry's estate, plus the equity in Dad's house. Mr. Rivers said he could arrange for the sale of the house to his development company for fair market value, which would give me enough to ensure Dad received quality care for the rest of his life. "And your cut, Mr. Rivers?" the detective asked. For the first time since we'd arrived at the station, Cole spoke directly. "I provide a service, Detective, helping families navigate complex legal and financial situations. My fee reflects the expertise and resources I bring to these arrangements." 50%, Denise said quietly. He wanted 50% of everything. Detective Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "That's a significant fee for consulting services." "It's a complex process," Cole replied smoothly. "Dealing with estate law, probate issues, guardianship proceedings, real estate transactions. Most families don't have the knowledge or connections to handle these matters on their own." "Is that why you forged Mr. Boone's signature? Because families don't have the knowledge to handle legal documents properly?" Cole's facade finally cracked. "I don't know what you're talking about." The detective pulled out the fake deed and placed it in front of him. "This document bears signatures from both Mr. Boone and his deceased brother Henry. The paper analysis shows it was created last week, but it's dated 11 years ago. Care to explain how a dead man signed a legal document?" Cole stared at the document without speaking, and I could see him calculating his options, trying to figure out which story would minimize his legal exposure. The full truth emerged slowly over the next 2 hours, piece by painful piece, as Detective Rodriguez methodically dismantled the web of lies and manipulation that had nearly destroyed my family. Cole Rivers, it turned out, was far more than just an opportunistic real estate developer. He was the mastermind of an elaborate elder fraud operation that had been targeting vulnerable seniors across 3 states for over 5 years. The detective spread photographs across the table, surveillance images of other victims, copies of forged documents bearing the signatures of dead relatives, bank records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen assets. Cole's operation was sophisticated and ruthless, preying on the loneliness and confusion that often accompanied aging, exploiting family dynamics and financial pressures to turn children against their own parents. "We've been tracking Mr. Rivers for 18 months, Detective Rodriguez explained. "He typically identifies elderly homeowners through public records, then researches their family situations to find potential pressure points. Divorced children with financial problems, estranged relatives with old grievances, family members who feel entitled to inheritance money." Denise looked physically ill as the scope of Cole's crimes became clear. He showed me newspaper articles about elderly people being scammed by fake contractors and investment advisors. He said Dad was exactly the kind of target these criminals looked for. Isolated, trusting, with valuable assets, and no one watching out for him. "So you agreed to watch out for him?" "At first, that's all it was supposed to be. Just keeping an eye on Dad's financial activities, making sure he wasn't being taken advantage of. But then Mr. Rivers started suggesting that Dad was showing signs of dementia, that he was making poor decisions, that maybe I needed to take a more active role in protecting him. The psychological manipulation had been gradual but relentless. Cole had presented himself as an expert in elder care, someone who'd helped dozens of families navigate the difficult transition from independence to assisted living. He'd shown Denise case studies of elderly people who'd lost their life savings to scammers, who'd been found dead in homes they could no longer maintain, who'd become burdens on children who weren't prepared to care for them. He made it sound like I was being irresponsible by not taking action, Denise continued, tears streaming down her face. He said that if I really loved Dad, I'd make sure he was safe and cared for, even if that meant making decisions he wouldn't initially understand. When did you realize this wasn't about protecting your father? Last week, when he showed me the forged deed. I knew Dad would never sign anything like that without talking to me first. When I confronted Mr. Rivers, he said it was just a temporary measure, something to establish legal standing while we worked out the details of Dad's care. But by then, Denise was trapped. Cole had recordings of their conversations, copies of documents she'd provided, evidence of her cooperation in what could be construed as conspiracy to commit fraud. He'd made it clear that if she tried to back out, she'd face criminal charges herself. He said the best thing I could do for everyone was to go along with the plan. That Dad would be happier in a care facility anyway, that the stress of maintaining a house and managing finances was too much for someone his age. He made it sound almost merciful. Detective Rodriguez had heard similar stories before. Cole's victims often included the adult children of his primary targets, people who'd been manipulated into betraying their own parents through a combination of financial pressure, emotional manipulation, and carefully crafted lies about their parents' declining capabilities. The investigation revealed that Cole had been watching me for months, studying my routines, learning about my relationship with Denise, researching the old feud between Henry and me that had never been fully resolved. He'd even tracked down Henry's old car and restored it specifically to mess with my head, knowing that the sight of it would trigger memories and emotions that would make me doubt my own perceptions. The psychological warfare was deliberate, the detective explained. Make the victim question their own sanity, isolate them from potential allies, create a narrative of mental decline that justifies outside intervention. It's textbook elder abuse, just more sophisticated than most. Cole had already identified 3 other potential victims in our area, elderly homeowners whose children were struggling financially, whose family situations could be exploited for maximum profit. If my case had succeeded, it would have provided him with nearly $400,000 in stolen assets and established a template for future operations. But now his operation was finished. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged documents, recorded conversations, testimony from multiple victims across 3 states. Cole Rivers would be spending the next decade in prison, and the district attorney was confident they could recover most of the stolen money and return it to his victims. As for Denise, her cooperation with the investigation and the circumstances of her involvement would likely keep her out of prison, but the guilt and shame would be harder to escape. She'd have to live with the knowledge that she'd nearly helped a predator destroy her own father's life. 6 months later, I sat in the courthouse gallery watching Cole Rivers receive his sentence. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, who'd clearly seen enough predators in her courtroom to last several lifetimes, was not inclined toward mercy. "Mr. Rivers," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "In 30 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered someone who has displayed such callous disregard for the welfare of vulnerable people. Your crimes weren't impulsive acts of desperation. They were calculated, systematic attacks on some of our society's most defenseless members." The prosecutor had done her homework. Over the course of a 3-day trial, she'd presented evidence of Cole's crimes spanning 5 years and involving more than 20 victims across multiple states, elderly men and women who'd lost their homes, their life savings, their independence, and in some cases their lives, all because they'd trusted the wrong person at their most vulnerable moment. Cole had stolen over $2 million through his various schemes, but the financial damage was only part of the story. Several of his victims had died in substandard nursing facilities after being removed from homes they'd loved. Others had suffered strokes or heart attacks brought on by the stress of losing everything they'd worked for. One elderly woman in Ohio had committed suicide rather than face the prospect of becoming homeless at 83 years old. The defendant's operation was not simply about money, the judge continued. It was about power, the power to destroy lives, to turn families against each other, to exploit the most fundamental bonds of trust between parents and children. The psychological damage inflicted on both primary and secondary victims is incalculable. Denise sat beside me in the gallery, her face pale but resolute. She'd testified against Cole as part of a plea agreement that would keep her out of prison in exchange for her cooperation and community service. The months since Cole's arrest had been difficult for both of us, filled with painful conversations about trust, manipulation, and the ways that fear and financial pressure could corrupt even the strongest family bonds. "The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison," the judge announced, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. "You are ordered to pay full restitution to your victims, and you are permanently barred from working in real estate, financial services, or any other profession that involves managing other people's assets." Cole showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Even in defeat, he maintained the same cold calculation that had made him so dangerous. I suspected that he was already planning his next move, figuring out how to rebuild his operation once he was released, identifying new vulnerabilities to exploit. But that was a problem for the future. Today was about justice for his current victims, and the knowledge that his ability to hurt people had been taken away, at least temporarily. After the hearing, I walked out of the courthouse with Denise and Detective Rodriguez, who'd become something of a friend over the past 6 months. The detective had been instrumental in building the case against Cole, and she'd also helped connect me with other victims of similar scams, people who understood the particular violation of elder fraud in ways that younger people couldn't. "How does it feel?" Detective Rodriguez asked as we stood on the courthouse steps in the warm spring sunshine. "Like a weight's been lifted," I answered honestly, "but also like there's still work to do." She nodded. "There are more Cole Rivers out there. People like him don't operate in isolation. They learn from each other, share techniques, pass along victim lists. This conviction will help us track down others in his network." Denise squeezed my arm. "Dad, I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but I want to help with that. I want to do something good with what I learned from this experience." Over the past few months, she'd been volunteering with a local organization that provided education about elder fraud, speaking to community groups about the warning signs, and helping other families who'd been targeted by similar schemes. It was her way of trying to atone for her role in Cole's operation, and I could see that the work was helping her heal from the guilt and shame of having been manipulated. We drove home together in comfortable silence, past the elementary school where I'd worked for so many years, past the hardware store where Crawford's law office was located, through the familiar neighborhoods that had been the backdrop of my entire adult life. Everything looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but I felt fundamentally different, stronger, more aware of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of ordinary life, but also more grateful for the genuine relationships that had sustained me through the crisis. The months following Cole's conviction brought a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years, though it was a different sort of tranquility than I'd known before the crisis. It was peace earned through struggle, understanding gained through betrayal, and wisdom purchased with pain. My relationship with Denise had been forever changed by what we'd been through together, but in many ways, it had also been strengthened. We established new traditions born from the ashes of our old assumptions about trust and family. Every Sunday afternoon, Denise and Emma came for dinner, but now our conversations included topics we'd never discussed before. Money, aging, fear, the complex emotions that came with watching parents grow older and children struggle with adult responsibilities. Denise had used the money from Henry's inheritance to pay off her debts and establish a college fund for Emma. But she'd also donated a significant portion to the Elder Fraud Prevention Organization where she volunteered. "I can't undo what I did," she told me one afternoon as we watched Emma play in my backyard. "But I can try to prevent it from happening to other families." Loretta had become more than just a neighbor. She was now a true friend and ally, someone who understood the particular vulnerability that came with aging alone in a world full of people who saw elderly homeowners as opportunities rather than human beings. We developed our own routine of evening conversations on my front porch, sharing coffee and keeping watch over our little corner of Maple Street. "You know," she said one evening, as we watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, "I never told you why I called that first day to warn you about not opening your door." I'd wondered about that many times, but had never pressed her for an explanation. "What made you suspicious?" "I'd seen him before, that man in the gray suit. Not here, but at my sister's neighborhood in Toledo. There was an elderly gentleman there, Mr. Peterson, who lived alone in a big house that had been in his family for generations. One day, his son started coming around more often, bringing official-looking people in expensive suits." She paused, sipping her coffee slowly. "Within 6 months, Mr. Peterson was in a nursing home. The house was sold to a development company, and his son had moved to Florida with more money than anyone could explain. Mr. Peterson died 3 months later, and his son never came back for the funeral." The story chilled me because I could see how easily it might have been my story. Without Loretta's vigilance, without her willingness to get involved, I might have ended up like Mr. Peterson, stripped of my independence, separated from my home, dying alone in an institutional setting while strangers profited from my life's work. "That's why you moved in with your sister for a while. You were scared." "Terrified," she admitted. "But I couldn't stand the thought of watching it happen again without doing something. So I came back, and I brought that camera, and I decided that if they were going to hurt you, they'd have to go through me first." It was a remarkable thing, the courage of a 70-something retired teacher who'd risked her own safety to protect a neighbor she barely knew. It reminded me that heroism often came in small packages, in the form of ordinary people making extraordinary choices when circumstances demanded it. Emma had started calling me Grandpa Clarence, a title that filled me with unexpected joy. At 6 years old, she was too young to understand the complexities of what her mother and I had been through. But she sensed the renewed closeness between us and responded to it with the natural wisdom that children often possessed. "Grandpa," she said one afternoon as I taught her to plant tomatoes in my garden, "Mommy says you used to have a brother who went to heaven." "That's right. His name was Henry." "Do you miss him?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. I missed the brother Henry had been before alcohol and depression and paranoia had poisoned our relationship. I missed the possibility of reconciliation that had died with him, but I no longer carried the weight of unresolved anger and guilt that had haunted me for over a decade. "I do miss him," I told Emma, "but I also learned that sometimes the best way to honor people we've lost is to do better with the people we still have." She nodded solemnly, the way children do when they sense they're being told something important, even if they don't fully understand it yet. That evening, I called Crawford's office and asked him to update my will. Henry's inheritance to Denise would remain as he'd intended, but I wanted to add provisions for Emma's education and establish a fund to support elder fraud prevention programs. It felt like the right way to turn our family's pain into something useful, to create meaning from suffering. 2 years have passed since that October evening, when Loretta's phone call changed the trajectory of my retirement, and I've settled into a rhythm of life that feels both familiar and fundamentally different from what came before. The house still creaks in the same places. The oak tree outside my bedroom window still rustles in the wind, and I still sit in my favorite chair each evening as the sun sets over Maple Street. But now, when the clock hits 6:01, I pause and listen with gratitude rather than fear. The sounds of my home have become a source of comfort rather than anxiety. I know the difference between the settling of old wood and the footsteps of an intruder, between the random noises of a neighborhood at rest and the purposeful movements of someone with malicious intent. More importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts, while also remaining open to help from the community of people who've become my chosen family. Denise visits regularly now, and our relationship has deepened in ways I never expected. The crisis forced us to confront truths about money, aging, fear, and family dynamics that we'd been avoiding for years. She's become my advocate rather than my potential adversary, someone who helps me navigate the challenges of growing older while respecting my independence and dignity. We've established clear boundaries about financial matters, legal decisions, and healthcare choices. But we've done so through honest conversation rather than manipulation or coercion. Emma, now 8 years old, has become the unexpected joy of my later years. She spends most Saturday afternoons at my house, helping me tend the garden that has expanded from a few tomato plants to a substantial plot that supplies vegetables for half the neighborhood. She's inherited her grandmother's green thumb and her great-uncle Henry's attention to detail, traits that make her an excellent gardening partner and a delightful companion. "Grandpa Clarence," she said last weekend as we harvested the last of the summer squash, "do you think Uncle Henry would have liked me?" The question caught me off guard, as children's questions often do, but I found myself able to answer without the pain that Henry's memory used to bring. "I think he would have loved you very much. He would have taught you to throw a football and helped you with your math homework and probably spoiled you with ice cream when your mother wasn't looking." She grinned at the thought of a co-conspirator in ice cream acquisition, and I realized that I was giving her something precious, a connection to family history that wasn't poisoned by old grievances and unresolved conflicts. Henry would never meet his great niece, but his memory could still contribute something positive to her life. Loretta remains my closest neighbor and dearest friend, though she's slowed down considerably since her 80th birthday last spring. We still share evening coffee on my porch, but now I'm the one who checks on her daily, who helps with her grocery shopping, who makes sure her medications are organized and her bills are paid on time. It's a natural progression, the way relationships evolve as people age and circumstances change. The elder fraud prevention work that grew out of my experience with Cole Rivers has become a significant part of my retirement activities. I speak regularly at community centers and senior living facilities, sharing my story and helping people recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. Detective Rodriguez occasionally asks me to consult on cases involving similar scams, and I've testified in 2 additional trials against Cole's associates who were caught in the wider investigation. Cole himself will be eligible for parole in 8 years, a thought that no longer fills me with dread as it once did. He's a predator who will likely return to preying on vulnerable people when he's released, but the law enforcement community is better prepared for him now. More importantly, potential victims are more educated about his tactics, and families are more aware of the ways that financial stress and emotional manipulation can be weaponized against them. The house feels different now. Not just secure, but purposeful. It's no longer just the place where I live out my retirement, but a center of activity and connection. Denise hosts birthday parties for Emma here because the backyard is bigger than her apartment's patio. Loretta's sister visits from Toledo and always stays in my guest room because her presence makes the house feel alive with conversation and laughter. The neighborhood children know they can retrieve stray balls from my yard without asking permission, and their parents know they can call me if they need someone to watch their house while they're away. I've made peace with Henry's memory in ways I never thought possible. I visit his grave regularly now, usually taking Emma with me because she insists that flowers make everything more beautiful. I tell him about his grandniece's accomplishments, about Denise's recovery from the financial and emotional trauma of Cole's manipulation, about the ways his inheritance has been used to build rather than destroy family connections. Sometimes I imagine what might have happened if we'd had the conversation we never got to have before his death. Would he have understood my choices regarding our parents' estate? Would I have been more patient with his struggles with alcohol and depression? Would we have found a way to bridge the gap that pride and misunderstanding had created between us? These questions will never have answers, but they no longer torment me. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require perfect understanding or complete resolution. Sometimes it simply means choosing to remember love instead of anger, connection instead of division, hope instead of regret. The neighborhood has changed too, in subtle but important ways. Mrs. Patterson installed security cameras after learning about Cole's surveillance activities. The Henderson family down the street started an informal neighborhood watch program. Mr. Kim, the retired postal worker who lives across from Loretta, now makes a point of checking on elderly neighbors when he doesn't see them for a day or two. Cole's crime wasn't just against his individual victims. It was against the sense of safety and trust that makes communities possible. But communities are resilient, and ours has grown stronger and more connected in response to the threat he represented. As I write this, the evening light is fading outside my kitchen window, and I can hear the familiar sounds of Maple Street settling into night. Loretta's radio is playing softly from next door, tuned to the classical music station she's favored for as long as I've known her. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, probably the Hendersons' new puppy learning to guard his territory. A car engine turns over and fades into the distance as someone heads out for the evening shift or returns home from a late dinner. These are the sounds of a neighborhood at peace with itself, of people going about their ordinary lives with the confidence that their neighbors are watching out for them, that their homes are secure, that their family relationships are based on love and honesty, rather than manipulation and greed. The clock on my mantel chimes 6:01, and I pause in my writing to listen. No footsteps on my porch, no mysterious knocking, no cars with watching strangers parked across the street. Just the gentle sounds of a life well lived and a community well tended. I've learned that revenge isn't always about punishment or retaliation. Sometimes the best revenge against those who try to destroy us is simply refusing to be destroyed, choosing to build something better from the pieces they tried to break, creating connections and meaning and joy in spite of their efforts to isolate and defeat us. Henry would have understood that, I think. He was always better at building things than tearing them down, even when his own demons were trying to convince him otherwise. In the end, his legacy isn't the anger that drove us apart, or the suspicions that poisoned his final years. His legacy is the love he left for Emma, the financial security he provided for Denise, and the opportunity he gave our family to learn the difference between trust and naivety, between forgiveness and enabling, between healthy boundaries and destructive separation. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Clarence's place? Leave your comment, like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.